What I'd like to do before introducing our distinguished speaker is to say again welcome and to tell you a little bit more about the Center for Asian Studies here at the University of Colorado. Many of you I know are familiar with the center, and we hope that you will continue to attend our events and to be a supporter in any way that you see possible. The Center for Asian Studies is a sort of broad umbrella organization that brings together faculty members and students who are studying Asia, and we interpret that very broadly. We include in Asia both East Asia and South Asia, and we're being imperialistic and even moving into the Middle East these days. We are interested in fostering public discussion of Asia. We have ongoing and regular academic events, which you hopefully get word of through our email list. If you are not on our email list and would like to be on our email list, there are places at the registration table where you can give us your address, and you will be certain to get emails from us. I would also put in a plug right now for an event that I'm organizing for the weekend of April 16th and 17th this coming spring, which will be about 5 or 6 prominent speakers, academics mostly, but also an environmental lawyer who's based in Beijing, a person who is a media expert who works on the Chinese media. All of them are coming to CU that weekend, and there will be another big event organized at that time, and you will hopefully be getting word about that and also hopefully attending. I think the weather will be more reliable then, although we are in Colorado, so you never know. The Center for Asian Studies also has fellowships for undergraduates. What am I leaving out here? Where we do as much as we can. We're growing rapidly. We are constantly in the process of writing grants so that we can continue to grow. It seems to be sort of our purpose is to write grants to grow, to write more grants to grow some more. But actually I think we are serving a very, very good purpose. We have more and more students interested in Asia from a variety of different perspectives. We have had more faculty hires in the last several years and have become a national resource center, one of, I think, 25 in the United States, meaning that we receive federal money from the Department of Education to support graduate students, to support faculty hires, to support purchases for the libraries, and so forth. We have also quite a range of other, also very important grants that we administer and benefit from. And as I said, one of our key activities is writing these grants, and we're right in the process these days of gearing up to apply for a second round of funding from the Department of Education. Okay. Well, I'm very pleased to have, we're very lucky, I should say, to have Professor David M. Lampton here. Again, I'll give you his title, which he is Dean of Faculty, the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies, Director of the China Studies Program at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, otherwise known as SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, located in Washington, D.C. Probably the foremost training ground for people who are going into government work and other work that has to do with public policy in its various different manifestations. It says a great deal that the dean of that institute is a China expert about the priorities of the institute and the wisdom, I think, of the institute. And in having Professor Lampton there, they have somebody who has been engaged in the study of China for quite a while now. Dean Adi gave some of his titles. I want to give a few more and not belabor the point with too many titles, but also to say that we have here with us a public intellectual in the best sense of the term, somebody who makes accessible his knowledge and his expertise in public fora, writing for journals which ordinary people read, not only academics, who speaks in terms that I think people can understand and relate to. And this is a very, very important function. Some of the titles of, and this is what the National Committee that he used to be the president of, and that Jan Barris and this whole evening has been all organized by them, is very concerned to do, is to promote discussion among people who really are able to speak in full sentences in terms that are not so academically arcane that ordinary people cannot relate. Some titles to add to those that have already been given. The most recent book, The Three Faces of Chinese Power, Might, Money, and Minds, came out last year. A few years before that, Taiwan's Elections, Direct Flights, and China's Line in the Sand. He was a co-author of that. Then the book whose title the Dean just spoke about, Same Bed, Different Dreams, Managing US-China Relations, 1989 to 2000. So that's 3 books since the year 2001, a rather torrid pace. The list goes on. Actually, there are more books from that same year. The Making of Chinese Foreign and Security Policy in the Era of Reform was the editor of that book, also 2001. The list goes on. Mike, as he tells me his friends call him, has many connections to Colorado, including serving on the Colorado College Board of Directors. So he's here regularly, I've just learned. And he may regret having said that to me, because what I'm going to do is ask him to come back and speak again when he's back in our state. But we're very glad to have him here. We're very glad his flight didn't have any problems. And what we're going to do is he's going to speak for roughly a half an hour, and then we will have time for Q&A. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you. I just want to say it's good to be here for all of the reasons that Tim just graciously introduced. I have a lot of connections, family, and interests in Colorado, the Colorado College, one of them. But it was so good to see my old friend Stephen Thomas here this evening. And his father, Cecil Thomas, was one of the founders, charter members of the National Committee on US-China Relations. And we were together. I won't embarrass us both by saying when we were tung shui. Quite a few years ago, but it's good to see you here as well. I thought I could usefully maybe talk about 3 things. First of all, I thought the commentary by our Assistant Secretary of State, Mr. Campbell, I genuinely thought those were very good remarks, and particularly the Q&A session I thought was very good. All I would say is that whatever one wants to say about the transition between the previous administration and this, it's been notable, I think, for 2 things. The previous transitions from one party to the next all along, occasionally it had quite, let's say, not smooth transitions. When President Reagan came in after President Carter, President Reagan had determined that maybe the people of Taiwan hadn't been treated right in the normalization process and tried to, let's say, upgrade relations with Taiwan. That created a kind of rough transition. When President Clinton came in, he hadn't been very convinced that George Herbert Walker Bush had paid due attention to human rights. And as a consequence, he tried to up the human rights quotient of US-China relations, and that led to a lot of friction. I think what's notable is this has been a very smooth transition from a Republican administration into a Democratic administration. In many respects on China policy, I think what you can say is what's notable is now for 8 administrations, we've had fairly consistent policy, which is quite a statement for the United States over that many administrations to have conceptually, I think, somewhat a consistent policy. But this has been a notably small, smooth transition. Secondly, I think Secretary Campbell would be just, in terms of the quotient, I would say in the Bush administration, the last Bush administration, a very high quotient of Japanese experts and Japanese talent. For whatever set of reasons, Relations, I think President Obama's come in with a very high quotient of China expertise. You can think that's good, it's bad, whatever you want to think about it, but I think it's notable, and the quality of the people in the administration that are dealing with China, I think they're very moderate, very thoughtful people that are well within the mainstream of the last seven administrations. So I think what you saw isn't just one skillful person, but I think there's actually, I would put it this way, and it isn't a partisan statement, it isn't because it's a Democratic administration, because I think we've had a lot of capable people dealing with China, but there is a high density. This has been a smooth transition. Could end tomorrow morning with some kind of crisis we don't foresee, but I think what you saw is indicative of more than just the individual that you saw. What I would like to do is, first of all, just say one word about Colorado's relations with China. Of course, you've got your university relations and lots of Chinese students, particularly in the graduate schools, and many of the particularly hard sciences and engineering are actually somewhat dependent on graduate students from Asia. And in particular in chemistry, math, physics. I was reminded, I went to the Johns Hopkins main campus graduation about 1.5 years ago, and when it got to physics, the graduate degrees, the PhDs in chemistry, physics, math, nanotechnology, and so on, basically, if you didn't have a Chinese surname, a Korean surname, or an Indian surname, there was a very high probability you weren't there graduating. And so I think this is important, particularly in a state like Colorado that has such numerous and high-quality institutions of higher education. You've got a lot you're doing with China, whether you quite realize it or not. But I was also looking at the trade statistics for Colorado. And if you look at Colorado's trade with China between 2000 and 2008, your exports to China during that period went up 209%, which is a substantial rate of increase. Your trade with your exports to the rest of the world only went up 11%. So the point is that China is, well, it's now your number 3 country that you're exporting in. And it isn't, you know, cattle and beef and minerals, although a lot of minerals go to China out of Colorado, but it's electronics and high value added exports. So anyway, I think it's interesting, your economic connections here. I thought I could usefully maybe, and I think it fits rather well with what you heard on the preceding program, talk maybe just about 3 things just in 7 minutes each, and then we'll go to Q&A, which I think will be lively. I think the first topic I'd like to talk about is the US-China relations, it seems to me, is really, I don't want to seem technocratic, but is a management problem. And the management problem is really how we are going to, as Secretary Campbell said, rising powers aren't patient as the previously dominant power is shedding some of its responsibilities. You have one power that's increasing its aspirations and another that's trying to adjust to its more modest circumstance. And this isn't always easy. So I think we have a management problem about how to deal with a rising China. At the same time, the United States is dominant, but perhaps less dominant. And in the situation where we're very interdependent with each other. So I just want to talk a little bit about that management problem. Secondly, I want to just make what may strike you as, well, at least a statement that requires some explanation, and that is that I think, in a way, US-China relations are stronger than they've ever been, underlined ever. Then that leads to the third point, which is paradoxically, while in some sense strategic foundation is stronger than it's ever been, we have, I think, more areas of friction and conflict with China than we've ever had before. So, a fundamentally sound relationship that in fact is going to be a treadmill of arguing and negotiations and half-a-loaf outcomes with the Chinese for as far as the eye can see. And our media, as they were talking about Obama's trip, I think were just the beginning of the kind of frustration that many Americans are going to face as they think about the issues that are important to us, and yet what are the outcomes of any given trip, is what the Secretary said. The deliverables don't seem very impressive in some sense, given the nature of the problems that we perceive ourselves facing. So I want to just talk briefly about each of those three things. Now, about the management problem, I guess I'd just make the following kind of points, and I want to stir up sort of people's energy level at this time of the evening. I guess the first thing that I would say is that, and Secretary Campbell was very careful in his phraseology when he says the U.S. is still the most powerful country in the world, but maybe we're a little less dominant. No public official wants to be on record saying the United States is getting weaker. And you will not hear at least any savvy person in Washington say that, because that will probably be the day before their last day at the office if they say that. But if you actually read what the U.S. intelligence community said under both the Bush administration and this administration, you will find that the assessment of the Bush administration in its last year in office and the first assessment of the current administration is really rather the same. And the Bush administration, when it left, issued a report, which you can go on, www. National Intelligence Council, NIC.gov, and look for a report called the Global Trends 2025. And what you will find that report saying is that power is moving away from the United States. It's moving east towards Asia, India, China, and that while the United States will remain the most single powerful country in the world for the foreseeable future, we will be less dominant. That was the Bush administration's understanding of where power in the world was moving. And then if you go to the current Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Blair, who testified in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in March, he said almost exactly the same thing. So the first part of this management problem is that I think the United States, coming out of World War II, was in a very special period of certainly dominance, at least within the free market, the free world, and that dominance is now, we're going to have to earn cooperation in the world by virtue of the intelligence of our policy. We can't command it. And I think you heard sort of undertones of that more modest assessment of U.S. power in what Secretary Campbell had to say. A second thing that I just been looking at a recent poll. So much great stuff's on the internet now. The Pew organization that does comparative polling all over the world. It's called the Pew Center for the People in the Press. Anyway, has a new poll out on American attitudes towards foreign policy. So not only are we somewhat less dominant in the world, but I would say Americans now are more focused internally and on their own problems as they perceive it than on the rest of the world. And I just pulled up their latest poll in November, and they asked a series of questions to Americans. And one of the questions, were actually three, it was asking Americans what their priorities were, what they thought the government ought to be doing in terms of domestic versus foreign affairs. And one of the questions says, do you agree that the United States should mind its own business, was the phraseology. And they've asked this question over time. And in 2001, 30% of Americans agreed with the proposition we ought to mind our own business, meaning presumably 70% thought we ought to mind somebody else's business, I guess is the implication. Now that has gone up to basically, well, 49%. Half the American people just say we ought to mind our own business and be less, I presume, interventionist, if that's one way to put it. Another question was asked of this sample, do you think the United States ought to be involved in democracy promotion? around the world. And of course, you remember President Bush's second inaugural address was pretty heavy, I would say, on the democracy promotion. In that year, in 2001, just before that address, 44% of Americans thought we ought to be involved in democracy promotion. That's dropped down to 10%. I mean, it's just fallen off the priority list. Another one, do you believe the United States ought to be defending human rights? And in 2001, the 43% of Americans thought, yeah, we ought to be doing that. Now 21% apparently feel we ought to be doing that. Do you think we ought to be involved in improving living standards around the world? In 2001, 37% of Americans thought, yeah, we should be doing, I guess, foreign aid and that kind of thing. Now 18% Americans. But the point is that not only do we have, I think it's fair to say, diminished capacities to determine outcomes, but we seem to have diminished will to be more interventionist. And so China's rise is occurring in the context of American popular attitudes. And that's going to be part of the problem that we're going to have to manage. Not only China's rise, but our own definition of what our role in the world relative to China and other countries as well ought to be. I think another part is not just that China's rising, but it's China is getting strength in multiple domains, certainly military, and I don't think that's the most important, but we can talk about that in Q&A, but intellectually and economically. And maybe just to give you a sense of what's happening. Historically, China occupied about 25 to 33% of global GDP from, the time of Jesus Christ's birth to 1840, something like that. Then it fell on hard times with the rise of Japan and the United States and Europe and imperialism and all of this, fell down to about 3 to 4% of global GDP. And that Mao didn't change that. Mao did not change the global economic position of the Chinese people, hardly moved the needle. But Deng Xiaoping comes along and the reform and opening, and that needle's moving up, and depending how you measure these things, China now is somewhere between 11 and 15% of global GDP. In other words, the needle is moving. And what we face is, I think, a problem. The Chinese are apprehensive that we are, as they gain global share, we're going to become more or less cooperative with them. They would say, try to contain us, to protect our dominant position. Of course, the Americans are looking at this rapid rise and saying, my goodness, how are we going to be able to compete? And that's certainly, you heard some of that on this. So I think that China's moving to reclaim global share of GDP and everything that goes along with that is creating an anxiety among the Chinese people that the Americans aren't going to be supportive the stronger we get, and we're somewhat worried about how competitive we're going to remain. That is to say, one of the management problems we face is the United States and China don't really trust each other. I mean, that's really kind of underneath it. And when you begin to look at the dynamics between our two militaries, you can, I unfortunately, see that. And I'm glad to talk about that in the Q&A if you want to. That dynamic that I've talked about is essentially conflictual. But what really, and Secretary Campbell mentioned, this is unique. This isn't Britain, and this isn't the Soviet Union. This is a combination of anxiety and interdependence that we've never really, I think, ever quite seen, certainly on this scale. And we've become, almost under the radar screen, we've become more and more dependent, or interdependent. It's not just the Americans dependent on the Chinese. Give you an example. About 25% of all China's exports come to the United States. That's a big chunk for any one country. The Chinese really need our market. Maybe a little less so than in percentage terms in the past, but still we're a very big market. And at the same time, while we're complaining about the deficit we have with China, China has been for a number of years our fastest growing export market. So as unhappy as we are, it is still the single biggest market for our fastest growing market for our exports. I don't need to even say much more than China, with all this currency that it's earned, is recycling it back into our debt. So thank you very much. We can have our stimulus program in a sense, because China and South Korea and Japan are buying our debt, which of course raises the issue, how long will they do so and how much interest will we have to pay in order to continue to get that money. And then finally, of course, we're interdependent in the sense that we're very concerned about weapons in North Korea and Iran, and lo and behold, the Chinese have better relations with these problematic countries than we do, and thank you very much. We would like them to exercise their influence on our behalf in dealing with these countries. So we have this, I think, very unique, not just in terms of scale, but management problem of, on the one hand, a kind of competitive dynamic, a kind of mutual security anxiety, but we're both in sort of two scorpions in an economic bottle where, you know, we're in this kind of unstable equilibrium. I would say the second point I wanted to talk about just briefly is I made the statement that should have caught your attention, that the strategic foundation for US-China relations is stronger than it's ever been before. And I believe that to be true, and I think this, many of you are not old enough to remember the old Timex watch advertisement. Timex, the watch that takes a licking and keeps on ticking. That was everybody is old enough to remembers laughing and everybody else isn't. But in any case, I think that's a sort of characterization of our relationship with China, and let me explain what I mean. If you ask yourself just basically, why did Nixon go to China and why did Mao have him? The answer is because we both feared the Soviet Union more than we feared each other. It was a very calculated realpolitik kind of decision. And that was really the foundation for US-China relations, with changed a little over time, between 1972 and 1989, when the Warsaw Pact fell apart, and then in 1991 the Soviet Union went apart. We cooperated with China have any of you seen Charlie Wilson's War, the movie? Well, we cooperated in very remarkable ways with China to bring that about. That movie didn't concentrate on that aspect, it concentrated on the Stinger missiles. But indeed, the United States and China cooperated to turn Afghanistan into a quagmire for the Soviet Union. And then after the Soviet Union went away, that of course raised the issue of then, well, what's the basis for US-China relations? And not only that, but you had the Tiananmen incident and so forth, which raised all the human rights issues that had long been, I think, suppressed. And so we had the problem of, okay, if you're President George Herbert Walker Bush at that time, or Clinton, on what basis do we have good relations with China? And basically, economics began to be a stronger and stronger basis for the relationship. But Americans have always been a little bit ambivalent when you say, well, we have this economic relationship, but what about human rights? When it's security, we don't seem to, when China was about security, we didn't talk much about human rights. But when we were this economic basis, human rights became more of an issue, and we felt more conflicted about, I think, how to deal with China. And you saw this during the Clinton administration. And I think that basic ambivalence went throughout most of the 90s, even as the economic relationship became more and more important. We didn't feel very good about it nonetheless. Then 2001, September 11th comes along. And once again, you maybe remember George W. Bush said, "You're with us or you're against us?" Jiang Zemin was on the phone in a big hurry saying, "We're with you." I think he read our president exactly right. And so once again, we have and are cooperating to some limited extent with the Chinese on anti-terrorism. And so once again, we had a security reason to be dealing with China. And we had now this growing economic underpinning to be dealing with China. But now I think this relationship has moved to a multi-basis. We have economic reasons to be dealing with China. We have security reasons to be dealing with China. We have global climate change reasons to be dealing with China. In other words, the United States and China both agree that we want stability in the world. We don't agree always how to get it, but we want it. And we're about stability, stabilizing the global economy, the global ecology, and the global security circumstance and proliferation. And I think that is a very forward-looking, diversified tripod of foundation. And that's why I say I think we may not recognize it with all these arguments we have, but underneath it, we've both determined we can't afford to make this relationship unable to deal with these issues. So I'm really not that worried about the future of US-China relations. I think we've become too important to each other to just throw the relationship overboard. It isn't even an option anymore. But that brings me to the third and final point, and that is that despite this strong strategic foundation, we've got many, many points. In almost every aspect of this relationship, we have fundamental conflicts of either, in some cases, values, but certainly of interests. And let me just tick off a few. Mention climate change. The Copenhagen conference opened yesterday. The United States and China, as he rightly said during Obama's visit, made some progress on that. But the bottom line is, China wants to be able to continue to emit more and more CO2. When you just strip away everything else, China wants a line on CO2 volume that's going this way. And the US is being asked to create a line going this way. And the American Congress is going to ask, you mean to say, in the midst of economic difficulty, we're going to let China have a line to go in this way, and we're going to have one going this way? I don't think so. And that's going to be a huge argument. Now, maybe Obama and the administration can win that argument. Maybe they can't. But it's going to be a huge struggle here, and it's going to be a huge struggle with Beijing. There are many other aspects of this, including on what terms should the U.S. transfer technology for green technology? To what degree should the United States pay along with other developed countries? Because after all, we filled up the atmosphere with all this CO2. Or at least we played a disproportionate role. The Chinese would point out each Chinese emits 4 tons of CO2 per year, and we do 20 tons per capita. Where's the justice in that? So, climate change, they're going to hear a lot of happy talk, perhaps, at the end of this conference, but underneath it, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. If you just take on the issue of proliferation, we got Mr. Bosworth today, Ambassador Bosworth in North Korea, talking about going back to the 6-party talks, and the Chinese have been helpful in getting today's meeting and pushing in that direction. But the long and the short of it is, China's not as worried about North Korea having nuclear weapons as we are. Bottom line, they're not as worried. They would prefer the North Koreans not have it. They would prefer there be no weapons on the Korean Peninsula. But even more than that preference, they care that North Korea not implode and create all sorts of problems for Northeast China, refugees. And frankly, the Chinese like having a pliable state buffer between them and a dynamic South Korea and so on. So you hear a lot about us both sharing the same interests on North Korea. We do to a point, but only to a point. And then if you think about global economics, I mean, just think about it. The Chinese have about $1.6 trillion in US-denominated, dollar-denominated debt. That means they really care about what the value of the dollar is. What is happening to the value of the US dollar? That means that the Chinese look at it, we loaned you valuable dollars and you are proposing to pay us back in cheapened dollars. That is really not their idea of a great deal. So we're worried about all the money, our dependency and the interest payments and all of that, but they're worried about, in a sense, have they made a good bet on investing in U.S. assets? So all I'm trying to say is that we've got this very ironic situation, a fundamentally strong relationship about which we all have very fundamental kinds of interest conflicts. And so this brings us to the Obama trip. Why weren't there big deliverables? Because these are really complicated problems and we don't agree and we are no longer able to compel them. We would probably never were in a position to compel China, but whatever position we were in, we're in a less dominant position today. Which then this leads me, and I'll wind this up, then how do we think about this? I think the key to good US-China relations is for the US to reform and renew its own domestic power base. In other words, we're never going to be happy with China until we're happy with ourselves, you know? And that means education, it means investing in R&D, it means investing in ways that allow us to move up the value-added chain to stay ahead of a very capable people that are moving at a very fast rate upward. So I think, you know, I guess I subscribe to the saw that the best defense is a good offense. We need to get our act together. The degree to which we have our act together is probably the degree we'll be less worried about what the Chinese are doing. But we'll be maximally worried about the Chinese if we see ourselves floundering. So with that, thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
There was a famous debate out here in Aspen in July with the economic historian at Harvard, Niall Ferguson, and also James Fallows from the Atlantic.
Oh, yeah.
He's been living over there for 2 or 3 years. And Ferguson was sort of trying to get a wake-up call to Americans saying, look, you know, the Chinese are not bad guys. They're not trying to really compete with us. They're looking at us as a prudent banker, and they're coming to the conclusion, unfortunately, and they don't want to come to this, but they just see the handwriting on the wall that America does not have political and regulatory structures that are robust enough to do what needs to be done to get its own economic house in order. We do not have the political ability with the U.S. Senate, which is like becoming revealed as the place where good ideas go to die, like they used to say about the Department of Energy, and that we just can't do what we need to do in new energy, creating jobs, moving into the 21st century, dealing with climate change because of big finance, big oil, big coal, big pharma, big media. It's holding us back. So other countries are seeing China as a world leader. Richard Cohen said in an op-ed piece in the Times that the other countries that are on the rise are looking at their free market authoritarian model versus our free market so-called democratic model, and they're seeing that we can't move out of the control of these regressive big economic powers within our own society, where China has very rapidly become the world leader in solar modules and wind turbines and so on and so forth. They've got Amory Lovins from Colorado over there as a national treasure doing everything he recommends, and we're doing nothing. So is there a possibility of educating Americans, like Tom Friedman's trying to do in New York Times, that China is not a threat? They actually are potentially a real powerful example of how we could educate Americans to say, hey, let's not fall behind the Chinese. If they can do it, we can do it, rather than trying to blame them as the yellow peril or this or that to stay stuck. And we're just going to keep doing carbon emissions because they're doing it, even though it's cutting off our nose to spite our face.
Well, there were a lot of implications of that, but let me just say that I think...
I'm talking to you as a public intellectual about educating Americans about China so we can use it as a lever to actually correct our own problems in this country, which are very severe.
Well, that's partly what I tried to do with my book. In fact, at the very beginning, I said, I'm writing a book about Chinese power. But this is a book about Chinese power that I hope will be a mirror where America can look into it and say, if China is intelligently increasing its power, has an intelligent strategy to use its power, what does this say about our own understanding and use of power? And so I fundamentally agree with you, and I think by looking at, and I would say China's, just to sort of answer the question in a way that will address what you're saying, is that I think there's three kinds of power: might, money, and minds. You know, coercive, economic, intellectual. And I think the core of the Chinese strategy is on economics and intellectual. They're modernizing their military, and there's a lot we could say about that. I'm not saying they're ignoring it, but that isn't the core. The core is economic, actually, and then intellectual, and I think coercive in the end. And I'm afraid there's a kind of predisposition in our society to think of power in a coercive way. And I'm afraid we're going to misallocate our response in the easy way. You know, remember Eisenhower in 1961, his farewell address. And living in Washington and going to Northern Virginia, you can see the power that's concentrated in what you might broadly call the security establishment. I think we can misallocate our attentions and miss that we need to rebuild the infrastructure for our economy and the intellectual infrastructure of our kids and get more, you know, let's say citizens. One of the great, I'm not anti-immigration, I'm very pro-immigration. I think it's been a great, but I think we need to get our kids interested in science and technology again. I was of the Sputnik generation, and everybody was going to be an engineer when I was growing up. I was the exception on my block. Well, we need to get people interested in that again. So I think correctly understanding what the Chinese are doing would be a wake-up call in a very positive direction, and lots of cooperative potential if we look at it that way. I would say, though, I think there's a little thing I am worried about. Not only us, because we often talk, I think Americans are very introspective in looking at their own deficiencies sometimes. And you know, a lot of times we're critical of others and don't look at ourselves. But I think that there's a problem, and I've talked to my Chinese colleagues about this. I would particularly noticed it in September when I went, but also in July. The Chinese basically, I think we're kind of on the skids. That maybe they don't have to pay as much attention to us in the future as they did in the past. That the United States is big on bluff and bluster, but finds it hard to actually mobilize for hard decisions. And I think we've got to, I think that's a very dangerous perception. Because first of all, I don't think it's an accurate reflection of our country. I think we will, at some point, snap to. And but on the other hand, if the Chinese, you know, in the Taiwan Straits or elsewhere, assume we won't act when, in fact, we might, this could actually be dangerous. So I think it's very important that the Chinese not over-interpret our difficulties, because I think we will get our act in order. So I'm kind of worried about what I would call is a excessive self-confidence after 150 bad years. The Chinese are glad to be back, glad to see that percentage of GDP going up, and you know, more power to them. They've made a lot of progress, but they better not overplay their hand. Bob.
Yeah, I guess I take a slightly different view. I'm not overly concerned about the sophistication of Chinese regulatory structure.
I don't think, did you hear me praise it?
No, I'm hearing that the command and control structure was somewhat better than our regulatory structure, that we don't have the wherewithal to control our economy, etc. And I spent a long time noticing that China has been talking down real estate development for 10 years, and it continues at a rampant boom pace. They don't have control of their domestic money supply, really. They don't have, really in so many ways, the central government is too weak and the regional governments are too strong. Half of their national tax revenue comes out of the local districts, flowing upwards rather than downward. And so, you know, it reminds me a lot of how Japan was going to bury us in the 80s. you reach a point where the sophistication of the economy rises to a level where a centralized control or lack of control in many areas of the economy will cause a long-term stumble. And I'm not too worried that China will get by that in flying colors. I am, however, do respect the Chinese. I put an investment in China in 1980, so I've been watching it for quite a while. And their response in Africa, by using their knowledge of special economic zones to promote economic development, is a model they're trying to export to Africa, really as a direct challenge to the Western models of economic development, which have not been very successful. And the West doesn't seem to be either almost aware of it or responding to it. And I wondered if you saw a response from the World Bank, IMF, and Western development agencies to that Chinese response, which may be also why they have asked to command the, have a rotation command for the fleet of naval ships of the Somali pirates, is to demonstrate their world standing to their African clients. And we don't really, as the West, seem to be quite aware of the political stakes they're putting into Africa at our expense.
Well, a lot of good observations. Let me tackle the first, because particularly on the lack of regulation, and China has its own institutional deficiencies, and we don't want to make the same mistake as Japan, #1 in the 1980s, and well, history hasn't played out in that respect, and I very much agree that I think China has a lot of institutional problems. I thought a lot about the regulation aspect, and in fact I went not too long ago with a couple congressmen to China on this whole issue of the regulation of the quality of their exports, you know, lead paint on toys and antifreeze chemicals in toothpaste and the melamine in milk and all of that. And that was a direct reflection, really, that China has entered the global production chain without a regulatory apparatus at all, and not only not consistent with our interests, but brand China suffers by virtue of this. So I very much agree that one of the big problems is China's unleashed entrepreneurship and involvement in the global system at a much more rapid rate than it's increased its regulatory capacity. And then there's also, one thing I try to convey to my students, there's a big difference between central policy and the way it gets implemented all the way down by the time you get to production units at the bottom. So I agree one of the biggest problems China is going to have is to get, and you mentioned macroeconomic control of the money supply, that's just another example, inability to control bubbles in the property and indeed the stock markets, and you could go on and on. So I wouldn't want anything I said to be, I agree with you, and we could probably an adaptability. I don't know what that says about Japan and its capacities in that regard, but I think we have to assume the Chinese will continue to make progress in a number of ways that are going to require us to up our performance. And I'll stand by that analysis. But once you begin to look at China in its details and its capacity to regulate, you're struck by the, I think you said, the implication was the weakness of the center. So I agree with that. But I would just observe they've been performing pretty well for 30 years, and I would say at the start of this period they had more severe problems in some respects than, I mean, coming out of the Cultural Revolution and so forth. So, but I'm not sure, I don't know that we have identical views, but I don't think it's as far apart. Now, on the development model, and I think it's true that, first of all, there's been a very interesting book written by Harry Broadbent, a World Bank book, I think what's it called, China's Silk Road in Africa, I think is the broad title, put out by the World Bank. And he asked the question, which is related to yours, has China's involvement in financial, economic, and developmental involvement in Africa been good for Africans? And I think, without doing much violence to his book, the answer is yes, but on balance, yes, but there have been some downsides. And you asked about the forms that some Chinese involvement there is taking. And you mentioned the naval presence and so forth. I think China wants its Navy to be able to protect the flow of resources into China increasingly, and this is an opportunity to be perceived by the international community as sending its Navy abroad for positive purposes. They don't want to alarm the rest of the world, so here's something where the rest of the world was glad to have the Chinese Navy there. They can learn how to interact with other navies, engage in this kind of thing in a non-threatening way. And so in addition to the status that it conveys, I think they also are trying to, they're rotating their own different naval fleets in and out of that so that they're using it as an educational device really for their Navy as well as a diplomatic tool. Also, just apropos of that, China has more peacekeeping troops abroad, and many of them are in Africa, including Sudan, although mostly engineers and not combat kind of people, than any of the other P5. There are other countries in the UN General Assembly that have more peacekeepers, but in fact, China even has peacekeepers in Haiti. And once again, I think they're trying to get the world used to the idea of Chinese, let's say, coercive presence in the world without alarm. In other words, I think they're trying to do what the Soviet Union didn't. That is, the Soviet Union wanted a global coercive potential, but it alarmed the rest of the world. The Chinese want to be able to have global reach without alarming, I think, the rest of the world. And so the Gulf of Aden, peacekeeping troops, becomes a way to get the world used to a Chinese presence without, I think, all of the alarm bells going off. In terms of development model, and I do deal with members of Congress taking them to China. They, particularly on the Democratic members of Congress, often worried that the Chinese model of, let us put it this way, capitalism and economic growth without democracy, that worries a lot of Americans if that model catches on. And I don't want to exaggerate the appeal of it, but I would just observe that people who are at the bottom end, countries at the bottom end of the income scale, the idea that you can have rapid economic growth, maintain social control, and keep the elite, the pre-existent elite in power as that happens, that's an attractive model. A lot more attractive than we, in our democratic ethos, would like to say. So I think the Chinese are more involved in Africa. I think actually Africa net beneficiary to that, but lots of downsides. And Darfur, we could talk about some of those right there. But that China's using this involvement to get the world used to the fact that China has global ambitions. And I don't mean territorial in the 19th century imperialist sense, but I mean China wants to be a comprehensive power of global reach. And this is just the beginning. And that's what one means by making room. The previously dominant United States, whether it's the air or space or cyberspace, all those domains where we were dominant, we're going to be running up against China and to some extent India and in their own more limited domains, Brazil and so forth. So I think this is, I don't know, is that responsive?
Just what is two things. One is the West doesn't seem to be responding very effectively to China's African development model. Almost doesn't seem to feel concerned about it, but it is very attractive. And the second one is it's very unusual that the Japanese have asked the British and or EU and Americans to share in a rotating command of the Naval Task Force off of Somalia in last month.
You said the Japanese, you mean the
Chinese, I'm sorry, have asked to share in the command.
Yeah, although I understand just in the last day or so, the Chinese have kind of backed off. I'm not sure how clear we
they're not going to see it as they're not welcome to do that. They're not really an equal.
Yeah.
And that's a problem in the sense of they're feeling their stature in the world as an equal.
Mm-hmm. But just you say the U.S. Or let's say the Europeans and the U.S. not reacting much to the development involvement in Africa. And then you have to get back to that public opinion data I wrote where you've got only 18% of Americans, down from only 37%. Now 18% even think, you know, development assistance and all that goes with it is what we ought to be worried about. So I mean, you know, in a sense, a democracy eventually has to be somewhat responsive to the perceptions and priorities of its people, and I would say that doesn't appear to be a big priority for us at this moment.
I would like to just add one thing about that Pew poll that you were just talking about. One of the other things, I was talking about this in my class the other day, is that I think for the first time in recent decade, a majority of the Americans now see China as a great threat to the United States. I think it was 53 or 54%, which is one other thing in that poll. So I think we have time for two more
Can
questions.
I just say one thing about that?
Please.
That poll was actually interesting because it also asked Council on Foreign Relations members what they thought. And they actually thought China was less of a threat. It was declining. So you have sort of foreign policy elites seeing China as less threatening and the populace is more threatening, which will create a whole nother management problem. But see, Professor Thomas.
Okay, let's have Steve and then Hyman. Okay, Steve and then Hyman and Hung, and then we'll.
I'll make mine real short so that maybe some of the students can get questions answered. Just one first question: how do we get some of our students from Colorado into that 100,000 going to China? Very quickly. And the second really quick question, and again following on what Secretary Campbell said, is there some way to convince the Chinese to be more mutually beneficial, as they used to say, in trade? That is, to get them to buy more or do something to really help us, because we are in a pickle on this one. And as he said, you know, well, maybe we should just convince them to buy more. But if we could, how could we do it?
Yeah, well,
if
I had the answer to that latter question, I would probably hold some other position, I would say. But I'll try to seriously address that. The 100,000 students and how to get Colorado students among them. Well, first of all, the program he mentioned, and I did go to a meeting at the State Department before the President's trip where they talked about what the broad conception would be. It's pretty vague. So, you know, presidential trips drive a process of setting broad objectives, and then frequently after you get back you got to fill in all the details that nobody ever thought about or had time to think about. I think this is, in a sense, and I'm not taking away anything from it, but don't exaggerate the degree to which this has been conceptualized. In fact, things are moving so fast, the numbers on which they based that 100,000, they assumed 100,000 would represent a sort of doubling of what would happen without this program. But then about 3 days after they announced the goal, the actual numbers on how many students were in China already were much greater than their baseline. So there is some probability we'll get close to 100,000 if the U.S. government does nothing, right? So maybe the next time you hear this, we'll be talking 200,000. I don't know. But, and secondly, the concept here was, he did say existing programs. And so what I think the government wants to do, at least it wanted to do a week ago, was set up essentially a not a government, but a non-profit organization that essentially would be a repository for some U.S. government money, plus corporate and foundation money to support students of various categories going to China. And so you've got to set up a non-profit organization to do this. You've got to find corporations willing and foundations that have the money now to contribute. You have to get the U.S. Congress willing in this budgetary situation to donate money or you know, appropriate money and so forth. So let's put it away, got a long way to go. But the answer eventually will be there will be approved programs and there will be a process by students can apply. And he said high school students and undergraduates and graduate students. Now, as it sorts out, maybe somebody will say maybe we shouldn't do high school students. I mean, I don't know. You know, so we got a long way to go, but Colorado students at higher education level, tertiary and secondary, will probably have, well, they'll certainly have as good opportunities as anybody else. Is that, you know, as to what to do just about trade, how to, you know, it is a real problem. In the end, the Chinese have lots of obstacles to our exports. And I'm sad to say that, but it's true. And the real question is, and of course the Chinese have good, compelling reasons to do so, given the huge unemployment and taking the peasant population and moving them into cities and population increase. China's got to find probably, well, last year had to find 40 million jobs, you know, and we're talking about losing 7 million. So you got, the Chinese have their worries, and we can understand why they, like us, don't want more competition. But the fact of the matter is they do keep lots of, particularly non-tariff barriers of various sorts to procurement and so on. So what do we do about it? Well, the first thing is we keep banging away at it. We have recently imposed some what we call countervailing tariffs on Chinese steel, particularly pipes of various sorts, coated paper, and so forth, where we feel the Chinese have created such excess capacity, so subsidized their exports and driven down the sales price in the U.S. to the point where our products can't compete even in our own market, much less exports to China and so forth. So, but that runs the protectionist risk, because I would say Congress is a little bit like a shark in water when it smells blood. And so you might say, well, we're just going to do coated paper and pipe, but you're going to have every interest group lined up for their protection. And also, I think the U.S. needs to think about its own well, example. In other words, how do we tell the Chinese, we don't like your buy China provisions that your government has on procurement on their stimulus package, but we have Buy America provisions that we just put in our legislation. So, talk to the Chinese about exporting sugar to the United States. Talk to the Chinese about exporting, crayfish because of the Louisiana lobby. And I mean, so the problem really is how we both can show more restraint. And in a way, given the severity of the global downturn, and China's exports fell by 23%, and ours situation's horrific as well, I'm a little surprised we don't have more protectionism, actually. So I don't know, the answer is I don't really know, but we need to have an example. If we're doing our Buy America programs, I don't really know what we tell the Chinese.
Okay, I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative, and I don't think we've had a student ask a question yet, so I'm going to have Hung, you had a question, and then Hyman afterwards. Hung?
Yes, you talked about the mistrust between the two nations, and I think aside from the conflict in interest you brought up, could you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There's also, I think, a lot of historical baggage, and the two nations tend to think about the current situations in different historical contexts, and by maybe I'm grossly generalizing, but I mean, for instance, I was brought up with a lot of emphasis on the colonial history, and that's made very alive in China. So I mean, in regard to that, how do how much is, say, American government or American media or any other American agency is aware of that and trying to counteract that in some way, and try to, I guess, how in general is Americans trying to win trust from the Chinese in this historical background?
Well, I think, just apropos of this 100,000 students, that would be an effort. And I go back to actually when Deng Xiaoping and President Carter first, even before we normalized relations, in May of 1978, the United States said the head of our Office of Science and Technology Policy at that time, a man named Frank Press, and we agreed to do with China what we never did with the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, we had educational exchanges. And if you had one physicist from the Soviet Union who wanted to come to, let's say, University of Colorado in the physics lab, then you had to find one American physicist that was pretty comparable to go and spend an equal number of days, measured in days, there. And needless to say, when you ran exchanges that way, you weren't exchanging many people. When President Carter normalized with Deng Xiaoping basically said we wasted a lot of time, but certainly a decade of the Cultural Revolution. We need to educate a whole new generation. We need you essentially open up your higher education to us, let us make up lost time. And the United States essentially agreed to do that. It's a little more, in its detail, complicated, but not in its end. Mm-hmm. And so I think I think the United States, frankly, has done a terrific job on the educational side of mutual understanding. I mean, I'll give you an example. I've got lots of students in my classes from China. China studies classes, they're coming to the U.S. for China studies classes. And when I want to ask one of my students says, well, what do the Chinese think about this? I point to the guy from the foreign ministry in my class, or, well, what do you think of this? Right? So I think that's one way, and I think that trying to increase exchange, and frankly, I think that's the most effective thing we've done. Now, the Americans, generally speaking, if you go to American public schools, it's I think getting better, but you don't have much Far Eastern history taught in American schools yet. It's state and local history, it's European history, it's American history, some advanced schools and some private schools, but broadly speaking, we're still not educating our kids about the cross-Pacific, Sino-American in particular issues as the substance of the relationship would warrant. So I don't mean we can't do a better job, we can, but I think that, you know, I think for 30-some years we've been on the right track on educational exchanges and so on. I think that's the most. When I talked about mistrust and strategic mistrust, I think some of this, what I was referring to wasn't just that. It was technologically derived. That is to say, take the fact that China shot down this satellite, remember that in 1997? This was a highly threatening thing to the United States because we built our whole military around the capacity to sense and communicate using space-based assets. And suddenly China says, we can threaten that. And our whole military is attuned to technological threat. So I think a lot of this is, and cyberspace, we become so dependent on computer regulation of utilities and all sorts, banking and so forth, that anybody that can interfere with that is a big problem. And China's got big capabilities and frankly is using them and not, and I don't know what we're doing. I assume we're doing some of the same things. But that's what I really was referring to. But I don't think we do as good a job as educating our children about the 150 years of humiliation. But I think we've done a pretty good job on education exchange.
I guess it's less about the education of American students, but more about how you can counteract. I mean, the Chinese education is very much capitalizing on this history, I think, in trying to, you know, any American intervention in China, for instance, would be interpreted in this context to its popular.
Well, I think China's government better be very careful. Because if they create a generation of very nationalistic young people, they're going to have a generation of people that aren't going to be very restrained when the Chinese government may wish them to be restrained. And what I've noticed is many of the older Chinese, say 55, 60, 65 and up, are in some sense less nationalistic than many of the young people. And I think this is a big problem for China maintaining a reasonably even keel in its foreign policy. I mean, you have to be a little concerned, when the bombing of the Chinese embassy and those. That was a quite alarming set of pictures that came out of that in Beijing.
Exactly. So, do you see any active role that the American government or otherwise could play to counteract this kind of?
Well, I think the Chinese. This will sound patronizing. I think the Chinese government's got the responsibility there. It's got to educate its people to a more balanced view of history, whether it's of Japan for the last 50 years or the United States. I think much of what's in Chinese textbooks is horrifying.
Okay, thank you. Do we have time for one more? Do you have any? Okay,
Sure.
You still have a voice? Okay, Hyman, you had a question, and then if yours is short, we can take yours too, and then we will cut it off. Okay, so Hyman?
So mine was partly answered, but in general with the whole Chinese and like interaction with the world. I was also wondering, currently there's a lot more involvement in China and South America. And that's pretty much knocking right on the door of the United States. And although the general populace might not be entirely interested in foreign policy, how is the United States government coping with the fact that China, as well as Iran, have their fingers in, say, Venezuela, Bolivia, partly like Ecuador, as well as meddling with Brazil? And everything from military to actual like economic transition with the new free trade agreements that they're having with Iran, which are backed by China.
The new free trade agreement with Iran.
Well, they're starting to form a free trade agreement between Bolivia, Venezuela, and Iran, and it's slightly backed by the Chinese government.
Well, you've got a lot of things there, but basically, I think one of the premises, of course, that's created certain difficulties in U.S. relations with Latin America has been the notion that it's our backyard, and we have a kind of proprietary interest, and so, you know, the fact that the Chinese are there, some military aspect, but mostly economic, quite frankly, and some technological cooperation, space agreements with quite a few, launching satellites for South American countries, Brazil and Argentina and so forth. So it's not totally outside the security area, but it's mostly economic and oil, Venezuela, and so forth. But in a sense, the U.S. protest that the Chinese there sort of takes as a given that this is our backyard, what are you doing mucking around in our backyard? Now, of course, the Chinese don't like it when we start messing around on China's borders and we cozy up to Vietnam, and the Chinese see that as, well, what are the Americans really up to? So that's another example of this kind of strategic mistrust. We each are very concerned about our periphery, and when the other gets involved, but that's what I mean, this is difficult to manage because the Chinese need oil. And, you know, why shouldn't they go to Venezuela? In fact, the world is an ocean of oil, and we're all putting our straw in at sucking out at different places, but it's still one global resource, right? So in a sense, we really shouldn't care too much. There are political reasons we might care. In fact, whether the Chinese pump the oil out in Venezuela or not, most of it's still going to go to the U.S. because we have all the refineries capable of, they've got a lot of wax in their oil, and we've geared up for it, and so on. So it's more economic, and obviously it's economical to sell oil because it's liquid, heavy, closer to your market than far away. So you've got a situation now where you've got Chinese oil companies going all over the world, but still selling the bulk of the oil to the Western world. It's just them doing the extraction in many cases. I'll give you a concrete example, though, of where I really come out on this. Senator Helms, when he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was very worried about what he called the Chinese potential control of the Panama Canal. And he had hearings on it, and I was invited to testify. And his basic point was, well, first of all, you've got two ends of the canal, and there are big port facilities at either end. And the Chinese, well, not the Chinese actually, Hong Kong company, I think it was Wharf Holdings, as I recall. You're shaking your head.
Hutchison.
Hutchison Whampoa. That was it, yeah. But it was Hong Kong company. Hutchison Whampoa had leased these facilities. Well, there was a kind of sleight of hand. Hong Kong, China, but it's all the same, right?
Ship Navigation contracted with Hutchison Whampoa to build the facilities.
Right. So anyway, his basic point was that there's going to be Chinese influence and strategic potential control, or at least interference with the previous domination of the canal by the United States. This was a problem. He had hearings. But at least my point was, yeah, the Chinese are the #2 user, I guess, in terms of tonnage going through the canal. And they're bringing a lot of soybeans from the Atlantic side of South America, Brazil, and some Argentina, and they're bringing a lot of resources, copper and ore, through the canal. It's as important, almost as important to the Chinese that canal stay open as for us. And it turns out that, as you sound like you may know more about this than I do, but it was American companies had been up against Hutchison Whampoa in the bidding. And the Americans, for whatever set of reasons, had lost the bids. The Hong Kong corporation won them. And then the losing Americans went to Congress and sort of generated a political rationale that would justify us putting the screws on them. So what I'm saying is that China is becoming more economically involved, but it's becoming more, in a sense, interdependent with Latin America for resources, soybeans, and so forth. And therefore, in some sense, China's developing a set of interests that aren't entirely different from us. We both need the Panama Canal to stay open. You see what I mean? It doesn't all cut in one way. So that's what I mean. It's going to be a difficult relationship to manage because we'll have lots of interests. Some people will think it's a good idea, a bad idea, but on the other hand, I don't. All I can report to you is we have a Latin American Studies program at SAIS, and I've got a lot of students now that are double concentrating, majoring in Latin America and China studies, and many of them are from Latin America. So I think it's a relationship, and I don't think we should fear it. We ought to get a sensible policy towards Latin America.
Well, that's
Yeah.
that's the whole point I was trying to bring up from Latin America.
Yeah.
I'm Bolivian, but I was just wondering what the general feel is of the United States government towards the current situation, in that a lot of the Latin American countries are following suit with China and with a lot of the Eastern countries in the sense of moving more towards.
Well, when you say the U.S. government, you want to distinguish, just as a broad statement, there's the executive branch and there's the Congress. And you can be pretty sure that views will be more polarized and extreme in Congress than they are often in the executive branch. But often we have a difference between the State Department and certain elements of our security apparatus. But broadly speaking, I think you get more moderate, thoughtful policy statements out of the executive branch than you do out of Capitol Hill. You have 535 entrepreneurs on Capitol Hill.
Well, is it a really quick and easy question?
Practical economic question.
Very quickly, please.
Yeah. In the 50 years that have passed since I graduated from CU, and then a half century, I've been fortunate to have a career in journalism, which led almost imperceptibly to an international marketing consulting firm. And I have fought the battle in the trenches against all foreign currencies and watched the decline of my American dollar into the toilet. And when I see Hugo Chavez take my dollar and throw it down and say, I give them petroleum, they give me this worthless paper, and it becomes a lobby that would love the euro to become the standard for petroleum exchanges. China holding 2 trillion of our dollars, one would assume, would oppose and actively arm twist and lobby for not allowing the euro to take over as the standard for petroleum. I'd like to comment on that. And secondly, would there be any inclination in China, as we often lobby for, arm twisting, to let the yuan float, and therefore would the dollar rise and increase the value of the China debt that we have? Could you make those two comments?
Well, there's a simple set of questions.
Yeah, this was your quick, easy question. We're gonna give a hint. He's tired. He's been from across Washington, so we're gonna end quickly.
I'm a
so you can
50-year
take this
graduate
quickly.
at CU. I'd like an answer.
Yeah, get an answer. I'm not saying no answer.
First of all, there aren't enough. The dollar is still and I think for a long time, going to be the principal currency of settlement.
Will China arm twist to keep it that way?
No. It's in fact, they've already made a series of statements. They would like to move towards some kind of basket of currencies where their bets would be hedged, but they can't unwind the position they're in any rapid, and if they tried to, that would destabilize the value of all their assets. So they're going to move gradually, but they also want, ultimately, the RMB to be a globally tradable. What are you shaking your head about?
They're very concerned about losing control of the RMB.
Oh,
An international currency.
Yeah, I think in the short and medium terms that's true. But I mean, you listen to Zhou Qiaochuan and so on, and Liu Mingquan, they've talked publicly about the need, first of all, to get a more stable basket of currencies, not total reliance on the dollar. And in the long run, they've been very clear that they're already doing currency swaps and loans of RMB to settle trade relationships with a large number of countries, including in Eastern Europe and so forth. So I think there is an aspiration, leave it in what time frame, and I don't know that they have a policy on the time frame, but I think they look to a future in which the RMB is at least a major currency of exchange and settlement. But I don't mean the dominant currency, but part of a group. Do you disagree with that?
No, they look for a basket. They try to stand up the SDR, but there's just not enough liquidity in it.
Right, and that's why I don't think they.
Right now there's no liquidity really in a global scale for anything but the dollar.
Right, but they're not going to twist to keep from the evolution.
They're friendly about it.
Right, yeah. So I think that sort of addresses that. The RMB floating, just to sort of get the historical record straight, from 2005 to I think it was July 2008, China did allow vis-a-vis the dollar to revalue, the RMB to revalue, and then they got panicked with a global downturn and they stopped that. I do think, and I don't know how soon, but I think China will once again get on the path of allowing some revaluation. Because now, in fact, the Europeans are even more worried about this. Well, I don't know about more worried, but as worried as us. And also many of China's Asian trading partners are worried. So China's coming under more and more pressure. China has a global trade surplus as well as a bilateral trade surplus. And I think there's increasing agreement that if we're going to correct some of the global imbalances, China's got to get a better alignment between what you might call its equilibrium exchange rate and the...
Which would result in a float?
Well, I don't know about, I'm not an expert, but I think the Chinese they're for stability and they like predictability. So I think they would try to keep control and keep it within a narrow band, which is what they had in a really narrow band before. But you know, totally free floating, I don't know. But that sounds to me like the thing that Chinese are generally nervous about.
Thank you.
And they're not going to do it any real soon, I don't think.
50 years of CU got that. Okay. Thank you very, very much. As these questions and everything indicates, we come at China from virtually every perspective imaginable. And we have somebody here who can answer from virtually every perspective imaginable. So we're very, very fortunate to have had this occasion. There will be more events. Keep your eye out and please stay tuned. Thank you so much.